So the X-Men first appeared in September of 1963 with X-Men issue number 1, and in the novel The Son of Origins of Marvel Comics, Stan Lee gave us an explanation as to how it was the X-Men came into existence, as to how it was that he and Jack Kirby had thought up the idea. And what Stan Lee told us was that up until the point of the X-Men's introduction, that they had conceived of a multitude of characters and teams. Of course, we had the Fantastic Four, we had the Incredible Hulk, but the problem here was that they had gained their abilities due to external factors. The Incredible Hulk had been exposed to the Gamma Bomb, the Fantastic Four had been exposed to cosmic rays, and Stan Lee and Jack Kirby rationalized that you can only have so many instances where characters are exposed to something externally that gives them powers before people begin to become bored of it. And so what he thought of here, what he came up with, was this idea of people, of individuals who were simply just born with their powers. And for him, this was a spectacular idea. And the reason why is because when you had an element where something external had happened to a character that gave them powers, their powers had to relate to whatever that external issue was, whatever that external thing happened to be. They also couldn't have powers that were just absolutely nuts, because again, if Spider-Man was bitten by a radioactive spider, he then couldn't turn around and become somebody who was able to manipulate reality. He would most likely have the powers of a spider. And so with characters who were born with abilities, there was no limit to what could be done. There was no limit to what kind of powers they could have. And so Stan Lee immediately jumped at this idea and pitched it to Jack Kirby. And the more that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee had gone over this concept, the more the concept began to take on a life of its own, to the point that they realized that this could really become something massively successful. And so what they did is they went to the head of Marvel Comics at the time, Martin Goodman, and they threw the idea to Martin Goodman to see what it was that he would think about this. But Martin Goodman really had a more antiquated way of looking at comic books, but also looking at comic book readers. To Martin Goodman, the largest majority of comic book readers were children, and children were not going to be able to grasp this concept of more adult-oriented stories. They were not going to be able to grasp this concept of what a mutant was. But Stan Lee disagreed. Stan Lee looked at the X-Men and said that it was Marvel's chance to tap into the older reader, to tap into those individuals who were adults in reading comics, those who were close to adulthood in reading comics, that are looking for more than these escapades involving superheroes. The other half of this equation is that the Fantastic Four was again the most popular team that Marvel had, and the reason for this was because they had looked at real-world events and they had paralleled real-world events in the Fantastic Four comics. And so what Martin Goodman did is eventually acquiesced, but there were constraints that were put on the X-Men when it went to publication. And this, a lot of people consider to be the reason why the initial X-Men stories had failed. Of course, we had seen characters introduced and teams introduced like Magneto and the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, but the stories for the most part were childish. The stories for the most part were never really anything that adults or near adults could relate to. And so with issue number 66, the X-Men had more or less began to flounder. But what we'll see is that while the stories were reprinted up until issue number 93, that in May of 1975, something would happen with the X-Men. A person would be introduced to write the stories of the X-Men that would look beyond their powers, that would look beyond the villains they faced, and would focus on the individuals themselves, would focus on what their ideas were, what their desires were, what it was that made them who they were, and that this would ultimately reshape the X-Men, not just in the immediate, but for the future existence of the X-Men in Marvel Comics. So by 1975, Chris Claremont was a fledgling writer for Marvel Comics. He was looking to move beyond the role of being a writer that wasn't taken that seriously, and wanted to be viewed as someone who could be a major player within the realm of Marvel Comics. And so Len Wein, who of course at the time was the editor for Marvel, had looked at Chris Claremont as somebody who could potentially be a serious writer. But the issue here is that Len Wein couldn't simply just hand over a major publication. He couldn't just give Chris Claremont the Fantastic Four or Iron Man. What he had to do is he had to segue in. He had to have him do like most every other writer had done at the time and start from the bottom and work his way up. And so while he was uncredited, Chris Claremont had, under the tutelage, I guess, of Len Wein, brought to us in May of 1975 Giant Size X-Men issue number 1. And what this did is it allowed Marvel to segue from the old X-Men team into the new X-Men team. And as we start this story, for the most part, what this is going to do is just give us an explanation of what it is that Xavier's doing. Of course, we start off in Germany with the introduction of Nightcrawler, and we see that for the most part, Nightcrawler is apparently escaping some sort of angry mob, and that this mob is pursuing him most likely due to his physical appearance. And this is confirmed as we read along and learn that they view him as some kind of monster, as some kind of devil. And because of that, their intention here is to kill him, is to burn him. From here, we switch to Wolverine. And what we get with Wolverine is this idea that while he had previously worked for the federal government, that the offer of working for the X-Men has been extended to him by Professor Charles Xavier. Now, initially, the government doesn't want to let Wolverine go due to the fact that he has been an invaluable asset given his experiences in espionage as well as his overall experiences worldwide in terms of operating for the government. But Wolverine looks at this as his opportunity to move away from working for the federal government, and so he immediately accepts the offer of Charles Xavier. At this point, we transition to Banshee, and of course in Tennessee, Banshee is attending the Grand Ole Opry, and Charles Xavier visits him. Now, Banshee had previously appeared in the original X-Men comics, and so for Charles Xavier, this was the idea of revisiting somebody he already knew, as opposed to pitching an idea to somebody that he doesn't know. And what he tells Banshee is that he's in need of a new team, that he needs someone that can undertake the role of helping to lead some of the new members of the X-Men that he's currently recruiting. And so Banshee, for the most part, appears to be on board. From here, we switch to Ororo Munroe, to Storm in Africa, and Storm, using her powers, demonstrating her abilities for those who are worshiping her as the goddess of Africa, is approached by Charles Xavier. And Charles Xavier says that he is in need, again, of a team, that he's in need of people who will help him fight the good fight in terms of leading individuals that will fight against those that will oppress the mutant population. But what he also says to Ororo Munroe is that she has incredible power, that she has incredible abilities, that her position as being viewed as a goddess among the people of Africa is something that can translate into the experience of being both wise and intelligent in terms of her role in the X-Men. At this point, we switch to Japan, and we see that that Charles Xavier is meeting with Sunfire. And Charles Xavier, again, like the other characters that we've seen before, is approaching Sunfire with the hopes that he will join the X-Men, that he will join this team. And what Sunfire says is that initially he's a little skeptical, that he doesn't really feel as though he owes Charles Xavier anything, and there doesn't really seem to be a reason for him to join the X-Men. But the more that he thinks about it, the more he realizes that maybe he owes something to himself, that while the Western world isn't necessarily something that he trusts, that perhaps it's his opportunity to give Japan a better view in the eyes of the world. And so Sunfire chooses to join the team of the X-Men. At this point, we switch over to Russia. And in Russia, or I guess the USSR at this point, we meet with Colossus. And Colossus, as he's doing farm work in a really interesting situation here, which of course is something that would be touched back on again in the House of M, is again approached by Charles Xavier after seeing him manifest his ability to take on a organic metal form and stop a tractor from running over a child. And what Xavier says is that he wants Colossus to join him, that Colossus is a very powerful foe, but Colossus also has a good heart, that he is a good person, and that because of this, he can use his goodness along with his powers for the benefit of the world as a whole. And so Colossus chooses to join the X-Men. He chooses to join Professor Charles Xavier and to leave his family behind. At this point, we switch to the Apache Nation, and this is a really interesting situation here because what we get is the idea of I guess the Native American element of America joining the X-Men as a whole, joining the X-Men as a part of their major team. And again, this is Marvel touching on the idea of having a multicultural team, of including a multitude of various people into the idea of the Marvel Comics to maintain this concept of a more progressive attitude. And so what we see is that as Charles Xavier continues to approach John Proudstar, that he asks him again to join his team, that he asks him to join the X-Men. And again, this is simply just Charles Xavier trying to enlist the aid of others as long as they can carry out the role that he wants to have the X-Men follow, that he wants to have the X-Men use in terms of protecting humanity. And initially, again, John Proudstar, like Sunfire, isn't necessarily on board at first. He doesn't really want to go with Charles Xavier. He doesn't like this idea. But what he says is that as time progresses, he wants to make a better impact on the world, but he also is baited a little bit. He's taunted a little bit by Charles Xavier. And Charles Xavier says that perhaps all the Apaches are weak, that perhaps they're frightened, that they're selfish, that they have no real measure of honor. And so John Proudstar agrees. He says that he's not going to be considered a coward, that he is just as strong as the next person, that he's just as great as the next individual. And so he chooses to join the X-Men alongside Charles Xavier. From here, for the most part, we see this team completely formed. We see this X-Men team brought to us as individuals are putting on their gear and they're assembling themselves in what would become their most common X-Men outfits. But what we also get is the return of Scott Summers. And this is really, really big here. And the reason why is because, as we know, Scott Summers was part of the original X-Men team. But when the original X-Men team went away and became X-Factor, that all the original members of the X-Men team had joined X-Factor with the exception of Cyclops. And what Charles Xavier says is that Cyclops is going to be the leader of the X-Men team, that he's going to be the leader of this faction of mutants, and that he will undertake the role of making sure that they are trained, making sure that they are effective as a team, that they are cohesive as a team. And for the most part, this is going to pick up with the all-new, all-different X-Men issue number 1 or X-Men issue number 94, depending on how it is that you count your X-Men comics. But this is going to begin this new introduction of the X-Men characters. This is going to begin this new revolution of X-Men characters. And again, with Chris Claremont taking over the role of the X-Men, it's going to give us this opportunity to see just what happens when the X-Men begin to grow and they begin to evolve, and we begin to look beyond their powers and we begin to focus on them as individuals. So with X-Men issue number 94, or the first issue of All New, All Different X-Men, what we saw was Chris Claremont being held up or being led as the main writer for the series. And under Chris Claremont, the X-Men exploded in a way that nobody had ever expected. The series grew to such a scale that it became the best-selling comic book that Marvel had going at the time. And the reason why was because under Chris Claremont, we saw an introduction of a litany of new characters. We saw the introduction of Rogue, Psylocke, Shadowcat, of Jean Grey as the Phoenix Force in issues number 107 and 108. We saw the introduction of Siren, Rachel Summers, Madeline Pryor, Jubilee. We saw all these characters coming to fruition within the pages of the X-Men series, but what we also saw was Chris Claremont launching spin-offs. Chris Claremont introduced the New Mutants in 1982. He introduced Excalibur. We also saw what many consider to be one of the greatest crossovers in terms of the X-Men related titles in the Mutant Massacre, and we also saw things like the Extinction Agenda. With Chris Claremont, he had revolutionized the X-Men. He had made the X-Men something spectacular, and this is why the X-Men were so successful. Prior to the Chris Claremont run of the X-Men, all we really saw in the comics was maybe some R&R time when they weren't training and going against foes like Magneto. Under Chris Claremont, we saw stories where the X-Men would be out performing their holiday shopping and then suddenly be attacked by Sentinels. In addition to this, what we saw is what many consider to be the creation of one of the greatest stories ever told in the graphic novel God Loves, Man Kills. Now, God Loves, Man Kills was created in 1982, and this was actually created both with Chris Claremont and Brent Anderson. John Byrne actually didn't have anything to do do with this. But what this introduced to us is what I consider to be one of the greatest villains of the X-Men, a villain named William Stryker. And the reason why was because William Stryker was an evangelical. He was a radical fundamentalist. He was a man whose perspectives of mutant kind could not be assuaged. He was a villain that couldn't be changed. He couldn't be reasoned with. He simply just wanted to see the elimination of all mutants because he believed it was his mission from God. And of course, this is the comic book that X-Men 2 is based off of. Under Chris Claremont, again, we saw the X-Men grow. We saw them expand. We saw some of the most memorable characters to have ever been in existence in the X-Men comics coming out of the Chris Claremont era. But what we saw in 1991 was that Chris Claremont eventually left and he stopped writing for X-Men. And when he did, we saw what many consider to be the downward decline of the X-Men comics. So by 1989, John Byrne had previously departed from the X-Men series, and so Marvel had substituted John Byrne with a series of artists to assist Chris Claremont in keeping the X-Men series popular. And while some individuals came and went, we eventually saw that Marvel had paired Chris Claremont and Jim Lee together. Now, while Chris Claremont and Jim Lee didn't necessarily have the creative element that Chris Claremont and John Byrne had, they were still able to create some great characters and great stories nonetheless. But the problem here is that Marvel was looking at the Mutant Massacre crossover event and the success that came with it. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to create more crossover events. They wanted to keep them as a regular thing. And so the problem that Chris Claremont and Jim Lee faced was that it was very difficult to maintain this very in-depth and this very intimate concept involving these characters while also building them up towards these crossover events. Now, that doesn't mean that all the crossover events were bad, not at all. In fact, Age of Apocalypse, which was in 1995, is considered by many to be one of the greatest crossover events as part of the X-Men franchise series. But the issue here is that by 1991, Chris Claremont had left the X-Men, and in 1992, Jim Lee had done the same. And so Marvel began to sort of panic here. They began to freak out a little bit. The reason why is because while they were maintaining these crossover events, while we were seeing things like the Executioner song crossover, in the end, we had seen this almost total loss of the up close and this in-depth character sort of an analysis that we had seen with the Chris Claremont run of the X-Men. And so this is how the X-Men continued. They began to sort of putter along. They began to kind of continue along and began to more or less just be a series of comics that was based on stories and not necessarily focused on the characters. But by 2005, Marvel had looked at the X-Men franchise. They had looked at the entire series overall and had come to the conclusion that for the most part, there were just too many characters to keep up with. There were some characters who were appearing and then were never seen or heard from again because the continuity was just too massive and too convoluted. And so what Marvel did is they launched a story called The House of M. And The House of M, of course, was the story where the Scarlet Witch had warped reality, but what it did is it allowed Marvel to consolidate the mutant population by having 98% of mutants lose their powers. And so where previously we had thousands upon thousands of characters, we now had about 200 or 300 that actually had powers. And of those 200 or 300, we only really had to focus on a handful in order for the stories to remain interesting, in order for the stories to maintain their intrigue. In addition, we had seen that Marvel had toyed with the idea of reintroducing characters with powers. And so what they had done is they had launched a story called the Messiah Complex. And the Messiah Complex introduced Hope Summers and her relationship with Cable, but what it also did is it was more or less Marvel telling us that of the 200 some odd mutants that are currently in existence, that others will begin to regain their powers while others will not have any powers at all. And so the mutant population began to grow and it began to expand, but at a very slow rate. And so with Messiah Complex, we saw the Messiah War. And after the Messiah War, we saw the 12 Lights. And again, this was simply just Marvel bringing back the element of some characters gaining powers. It was their chance to introduce new characters, to introduce new abilities based on the idea that while other characters had lost their powers, that the powers couldn't have simply just disappeared, that they had to have gone somewhere. Now, by 2012, Marvel was also introducing a Marvel-wide event called Marvel Now, and what this did is it allowed Marvel to go back and to consolidate all these backstories of all these characters and all these events across the Marvel board. But what it also did is it gave them the chance to look at individuals within the realm of the X-Men franchise and to ask the question, who should get their own comics? And so that's when we saw stories like Magneto. We saw characters like Magneto getting their own stories with Magneto issue number 1. And of course, things continued along this path up until the current day, where we of course have the all-new X-Men, which is where X-Men from the past in an alternate dimension have been brought to the main Earth 616 dimension and then sent to the Ultimate Universe. Now, what Marvel will intend to do with the X-Men in the future is something we're not really sure of. All we know is that over the course of the X-Men's history, we saw them introduced as a group of teenagers. Then we saw them, elevated to a more in-depth and a more adult-oriented